Hello and welcome. I'll give everybody a minute to come in. Great to see you all. I hope everybody has a good lunch in front of them. It's going to be a great discussion. Really excited to have Rob Moore here, formerly of NRDC, to talk about insurance, and even more excited, I have to say, to walk you through what we released yesterday, a new tool for New Jersey. All right. Hello and welcome. I am Amy Chester. I'm the director of Rebuild by Design. Really great to have you here and our, I don't know, sixth, seventh installment of our New Jersey event series. Yesterday, we, as I mentioned, released a tool, actually two tools, so New Jerseyans can understand their risk and the infrastructure that is nearby, what those risks are as well. Your schools, your hospitals, your pretty much anything that you rely on to function. So excited to talk to you about that because climate change presents economic risks to New Jersey, threatening infrastructure, housing, tourism, and agriculture. Flood exposure specifically to public assets drives long-term municipal costs through damage, service disruption, insurance, capital replacement, and that ultimately increases the taxpayer burden as communities need to repair and repair. And at the same time, there's a multi-billion-dollar budget deficit in New Jersey. But we also know that these costs are hitting both our individual and our family costs and government costs. So New Jersey has seen, and these are all New Jersey stats, rising costs for energy, 33% in 2 years. And we have seen that the governor has frozen energy rates. That was her first executive action when she came in January. Home insurance costs are rising, car insurance costs are rising, healthcare is rising, and it's also becoming more and more expensive for government to respond to storms. So Hurricane Ida, which took us all by surprise in the region, it cost $2 billion in New Jersey. That's an enormous amount of money for a storm that we weren't even, kind of evacuated for. And that, of course, was a rainstorm versus Hurricane Sandy, where the majority of the destruction came from storm surge. New Jersey can't afford to wait any longer. As many of you know, we have a county by county look on our website of the Atlas of Accountability that takes users through a lot of information for their state and updated the New Jersey findings recently. New Jersey has had 14 federal disaster declarations between 2011 and 2024, resulting in $8 billion of post-disaster assistance, which is ranked fifth in the nation per capita. Every county has experienced this and have experienced five or more disasters, and 50% more than seven. And in order to kind of acquaint yourself with that information on the very localized level, we released two interactive flood mapping tools yesterday. One that is focused on the 21 counties, and the other that analyzes 8 cities, and we'll be adding more to come. And what we looked at was 3.5 million parcels in New Jersey and 19,000 public infrastructure assets. We combined over 15 data sources. It took us about a year to work on this. And the underlying data comes from Rutgers New Jersey Design Flood Elevation Maps, which are the same that New Jersey DEP uses. So we have the same information. And just want to show and remind everybody that flood maps are a conservative approach. 20 to 50% of all flood damage happens outside of floodplains. So here are our key findings. We found that 1 in 4 analyzed pieces of New Jersey infrastructure that we all rely on are at risk of flooding today. And in 25 years, really 24 years, that increases to 1 in 3. So a third of all critical infrastructure in New Jersey will have flood risk by 2050. And that's about $436 billion of property value in 2025, sorry, 2050, and about $6 billion in annual tax revenue at risk. And if we're not collecting taxes, we're not able to keep our infrastructure up. By 2050, we have dozens and dozens, over 1,000 parks, hundreds of schools, over 100 libraries, hospitals, and airport facilities that are going to face flood risk. By 2050, nearly 50% of assets, which are 400 assets in Jersey City, and nearly 98% of assets in Atlantic City are projected to flood. And displacement is already underway with the New Jersey Blue Acres program, which is a really, really helpful and great program, which many states don't even have, including New York. Has already acquired about 1,600 properties, which means that there's already been displacement of New Jerseyans over 1,600 times. And the future is now. We analyzed the National Flood Insurance Program, which are NFIP, which is the FEMA-backed flood insurance, and they have already paid out over $6.5 billion in claims since 2019, and that's over 230,000 claims across New Jersey. So this is happening all the time. Ocean County being the highest with $2.6 billion of claims. Sorry, my back is not working. It's opposite. Give me 1 second to figure this out. Here we go. So this is what the tool looks like. This is the county level tool, and it brings you to the map of New Jersey that is showing you the displacement statistics from our displacement report. I'll just go back, sorry. And what these colors do on the left-hand side show you who has high flood risk and is low income. And those are the people who are likely, if they had to move, would need government's help. The people who have higher flood risk and higher income, and those are people who might choose to leave on their own ahead of time. And then the areas that have low flood risk and lower income are going to be the areas that we predict people move to, putting additional strain on that market. And the areas that are low flood risk and higher income are the ones that we think are going to be pretty stable. And you can toggle between those. I'm not showing you a live demo. These are just the slides, but you can check it out. And Aaliyah will put the link in the chat when I'm done. If you click on any county, or if you put in your address on the left-hand toolbar, or if you use a drop-down menu on the left-hand side, you can choose a county. And here's Middlesex, just as an example. And Middlesex has 245,000 parcels that are at risk in 2025, meaning now, which is about 3% of all at risk. And that's going to rise to 9.5% in 2050. The market value of those parcels today is $5 billion, and the market value is going to go up to $14 billion, and that's just using today's dollars, so it's going to be obviously a lot more. The tax revenue at risk is $100 million today, and that is going to triple to $300 million in the future. You can see the percentage of the different displacement categories. You can see how many Blue Acre sites have already been bought out in New Jersey. And then the right-hand side, you can see a number of different infrastructure. So your parks, your libraries, your power plants, your solid waste management sites, a lot of different infrastructure. And you can see the number that is at risk today and the number that will be at risk in the future. You can also take a look at where buyouts have already happened. So these are places and people that have already been displaced from flooding, specifically flooding in New Jersey. And we mapped all of them, and you can take a closer look and even a closer look to the parcel level data. Again, you could put in an address or you can just zoom in. And then you can also download county by county fact sheets that have all of this information and additional information from our earlier reports all in one. The second tool that we released is a city mapping tool that we have for 8 cities, and more cities will come online soon. What you're looking at here now is Jersey City and its current flood risk and all of the infrastructure that is within the flood zone currently. And then you can toggle on the left-hand side to future flood risk. And you can then isolate on the left-hand side just specific assets. So right now what you are seeing here is just contaminated sites in Jersey City. Here's what it looks like for just parks in Jersey City. And we have this data for the entire state. So for every single place in the state, we have the public assets, we have the 2025 risk, the 2050 risk. And on the right-hand side, you can see the data sources that we used. If you go on the tool, there's a little eye in the bottom right here hand corner. Depending on what screen you're on, it will tell you all of the data sources that we used. Who is this tool for? It's really for everybody. It's for you, it's for us, it's for residents to understand and check if their critical infrastructure is at risk. That's their schools or hospitals. It's for local governments to understand the tax revenue that is at risk. It's for agencies to understand their assets at risk and to be able to prioritize for areas that are, potentially lower income areas that are going to need it the most. It's for communities to understand where displacement has already happened, and of course, for press to use it as an ongoing resource. And we really believe that we are going to pay for this one way or another, and our choice is to pay for it before communities suffer. The American Society of Civil Engineers has given New Jersey a D+ grade on their infrastructure report. And we know from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that every dollar not invested in disaster resilience today can cost communities up to $33 in lost future economic activity. But every dollar invested today saves $13 in mitigation costs. So our solution, as many of you know, is to create a resilient infrastructure fund in New Jersey. We were instrumental in creating one in New York. New York has a $4.2 billion infrastructure fund, and they have already given out $1.9 billion of projects. They've supported projects throughout the entire state. In New Jersey, we think a right size could be around $3 billion, and we want that to concentrate on lowering flood risk, water infrastructure, and climate resilience. And we know that New Jersey voters want this too. 76% support a $3 billion public bond. And we also know that this could create tens of thousands of jobs. We worked with the AECOM to do a job study, and we know that a $3 billion bond can support about 26,000 to 45,000 jobs in many industries. Super excited to be here today and have this conversation with our colleague, Rob Moore, who we've been working with for really feels like forever and ever. Also want to remind you that we have our other New Jersey event series videos on our YouTube page, so check it out. I'm going to stop sharing now and introduce Rob. Rob Moore, come on. Hello. I'll just introduce you by explaining that you were the former director of climate adaptation at NRDC, working on issues related to climate resilience, adaptation, including what the role of insurance and markets can play in advancing and supporting these objectives. You're obviously an expert in many, many places, including national flood insurance and really everything. I can't tell you how many times that I've called Rob Moore over the past decade and said, can you help us with blank, whatever it may be. And for those of you that are from New York, you might not know that Rob actually ran Environmental Advocates. And I don't know, 30 years ago, Rob, I hate to date both of us, but that's how we know each other. So great to see you. I'm going to put myself out of view so you can take over and present your report.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Amy, and thanks to everybody at Rebuild Design, including Aaliyah and Johanna, for making this possible, and for everybody who tunes in today to hear both the excellent information that Amy presented on flood risk and increasing flood risk in New Jersey, and the information I'm going to share about what's happening at the intersection of homeowners insurance and climate impacts around the country. So bear with me while I bring up my presentation quickly. But I'm going to be talking about a report that I authored for NRDC and was released at the end of February, called An Uninsurable Country. And in that, we talk about a few things about how the increasing frequency and severity of disasters, particularly climate-influenced storm events and disasters, are affecting insurance markets. And by insurance markets, I mean, what do you and me and everybody else actually pay to insure our homes, whether you're a homeowner or whether you are a renter and are paying for that, maybe not directly, but through the rents that you are being charged. My computer, I have the horrible spinning disc of death that has suddenly
Yeah.
come up
And I
here.
also see that we're not seeing your full screen. So let's give it one more second. There seems to be
Yeah.
a lot of changes in Zoom today. I had the same problem, and if not, Aaliyah can help us by presenting your slides.
If we need to, I'll maybe ask Leah to pull up my slides as a
Okay,
PDF that's more reliable, and we can go from
no
there.
problem.
Let's give it a shot here. Boy, this is horrible.
Aaliyah, it's okay.
How about now?
We got it. Aaliyah is just going backwards. And here we go.
Great. So first off, I just want to talk a little bit about what does it mean to be in an insurability crisis? Well, what the heck? This thing just locked up on me again. Aaliyah, maybe you could,
We,
wow, my apologies. Can you see
oh,
this?
it's on your screen. Okay, yeah. Aaliyah, if you can share, please.
Okay. Um, so first off, if you've been paying attention to the news and seen stories about how insurance is becoming more costly or even completely unavailable, depending on where you live. This is really showing up in states like California and Florida and Louisiana, but it's really happening all over the country. You often hear this described as an insurance crisis. And I personally don't like using that term because an insurance crisis would seem to suggest that this is a crisis for both people who are seeking insurance and having to pay for insurance on their property, as well as the insurance industry and the insurance companies who sell that product. The fact of the matter is, this isn't much of a crisis at all for the insurance industry. They have continued to make record profits year after year, despite the mounting losses and damages that they're covering. And the reason for that is because insurers have basically two tools for managing these risks. The first is to raise premiums to recover losses that they're having to pay out for the damages. The second tool they have is to simply not cover properties that are likely to be damaged. Neither of those outcomes are good for consumers and homeowners, and neither of those tools, when applied, are particularly good for communities as a whole. So I prefer to talk about this as an insurability crisis. And by insurability, I mean um, what preconditions need to be in place for a property to be insurable, to be at low enough risk that an insurance company is willing to cover it and cover it at a price that the owner is willing to pay.
Rob, we
Um,
have your slides up now. Aaliyah has it, so just let us know when you want to advance
okay.
or near what makes home insurable. I don't know if you can see it with the issues, but
Oh,
we can see
okay.
it.
I'm looking at a different presentation on my computer. So,
Yes, we might have to move to your Zoom screen.
okay, great. I see where we're at here. Um, so what makes a home insurable? Well, there's primarily two factors that go into that. There's myriad factors, but the two main ones are location and the methods of construction for building that home. So the location basically says um, what hazards is a home going to be exposed to? So if you live in California, you're much more likely to be exposed to wildfire, for instance. Or if you live in a forest or along a forest edge, wildfire is going to be your biggest concern. You live in the southeastern United States on the coast, hurricanes are going to be a bigger problem for you. You live in the Midwest, severe convective storms, hail, and tornado are going to be a bigger deal. So location kind of determines the exposure you have to certain types of hazards. Then the construction of your home kind of determines the vulnerability you have to those hazards. If you live in California and you have wood siding and wood shingles, you're going to be far more vulnerable to wildfire than if you had fire resistant materials uh, as the cladding for your home. So when you combine exposure and vulnerability, that's essentially your risk. The other thing to consider here, and that people are getting caught up in this insurability crisis, is that a home that was insurable in the past may not be insurable in the future because the risks are changing each and every year due to climate change. And as those risks change, an insurance company's determination of how insurable your home is changes as well. And that is kind of what's at the core of the problems that we're now experiencing around the country. Next slide, please. So the other thing that ultimately makes a home insurable, though, is an insurer willing to accept the risk of paying to repair potential damages in the future? And are they willing to price that insurance um, at a level where the homeowner is willing to pay it? So, this is really kind of the crux of the matter right now. So what I want to talk about for the most of the rest of this presentation are kind of four indicators that your state may be entering an insurability crisis and what can be done about it. Next slide. So the warning signs of an insurability crisis um, basically fall into four categories. So rising damages from climate influenced disasters, increasing insurance premiums year after year, rising numbers of uninsured homes, and rising enrollment in what we call generically FAIR plans. But these are state-created insurers of last resort that exist in most, but not all, states in the nation. Next slide. So the rising damage from climate-influenced natural hazards is probably no surprise to the people on this webinar right now. Just looking at national statistics going back to the 1980s, there's a clear trend towards more frequent disasters that are influenced by climate change and more damage being caused by those disasters. So this is a graph of data put together by NOAA, used to be put together by NOAA, called their $1 billion disaster database. This is only disasters that caused at least $1 billion of economic losses. So there's actually a lot of disasters not even captured in this graph. So a lot of storms don't cause at least $1 billion of damage. But if you look at these larger events, you can see the trend line is pretty clear here. And these are all adjusted for consumer price index. So inflation has already been normalized in this. So the 1980 dollars on the left are equivalent to the 2024 dollars on the right side of this chart. But the signal here is pretty clear. Damage is occurring because these events are happening more frequently, and when they happen, they are often far more severe. Next slide, please. So if you break those numbers down by hazard, a couple interesting things kind of emerge. So at the number one cause of damage in the United States are hurricanes and tropical storms. We typically think of these as causing damage in coastal areas, but as some events like Hurricane Helene in 2024 showed us, even very far inland, hundreds of miles inland, hurricanes can cause tremendous damage just from the sheer volume of rainfall that they cause. Hurricanes bring damage in the form of both storm surge, but also flooding and wind damage. And somewhat surprising to people is the next most damaging hazard in the United States are severe convective storms. So we're talking about thunderstorms essentially that roil across the Midwest and Great Plains in particular, but Northeast and Southeast are no stranger to them, and bring a lot of damage from hail as well as straight line winds, tornadoes, and they also can contribute to flooding, although that damage is captured lower down in the table. Severe convective storms aren't the types of things that typically make the evening news, though, right? These tend to be more dispersed events. They happen over enormous areas of geography, may cause damage on one block, but not another. But they are quite pervasive and quite damaging. Next slide, please. So as damage occurs, insurers are going to pay out those claims and they're going to incur underwriting losses as a result. And they are going to try to make up for those losses by increasing premiums on all of the other policyholders in a state. Next slide. And we can see, even if your home hasn't been damaged in an event, even if a major disaster has not occurred in your county recently, you are still paying for those disasters through your insurance premiums. Across the country, we have seen insurance premiums increase 24% since 2021. Among the states that have seen the highest increases are Utah, Illinois, Arizona, and Pennsylvania. And it's not just the premiums people are paying, it's also the deductibles that people may be paying. And we can talk a little bit more about insurance deductibles if people have questions, but a deductible is a different way of pricing insurance. It may be advantageous to a policyholder, it may not be. But a deductible is basically you pay out of pocket a certain amount before insurance starts to cover your losses. And even the deductibles are increasing as fast as the cost of premiums as well. Next slide, please. The next big indicator of whether an insurability crisis is taking root in your state is the rising number of uninsured homes. So people begin to lose coverage from private insurers, usually through two mechanisms. One, a policyholder, an insurance company may simply determine that your home's too high of a risk to cover and drop you, and then you have to go find coverage somewhere else. Or the price of insurance may get so high that the homeowner is simply unable or unwilling to pay it and drops the coverage themselves. But we know, regardless of the reason people are dropping or losing coverage, we know that number is increasing very quickly. In fact, the number of uninsured homes has roughly doubled since 2019, according to the Insurance Information Institute. And we know it's between 7 and 13.5% of homes in the United States are uninsured presently. And there are some states where this is hitting a lot harder than in other states. So that number's doubled, and the number of not the non-renewal rate, so that is the number of policies dropped per 100,000 policies in a state, has doubled in Texas, Mississippi, Kentucky, and Virginia. It's tripled in other parts of the country like South Carolina, Nevada, Oklahoma, and Utah. And it's gone up by 4 or 5 times in the states of Washington, California, and Louisiana. So when you start seeing large numbers of uninsured homes, you know that your state is going through an insurability crisis. Next slide. And then the final indicator of an insurability crisis is rising enrollment in state-created insurers of last resort. So generically, I refer to these as FAIR plans. So FAIR plans are state-created, but largely managed and operated as a partnership with private insurers. The state creates them through statute, but does not actually play an active role in administering them. And they generally do not have a direct impact on state budgets, with one or two notable exceptions. Um, but these state-created insurers of last resort are basically where you go to purchase insurance if the private insurance market no longer wants your business. And since 2020, about 1.2 million American homes have been forced to start buying their coverage from FAIR plans because the private market has basically walked away from them. Most of those properties, or at least a large portion of those, are in California and Louisiana, but they are not exclusive to those states. And we see FAIR plan growth happening in other places around the country that you might not think about as being particularly susceptible to disasters. Kentucky, Oklahoma, are among the states that you see pretty rapid growth as well. And unfortunately, that may be just the beginning for them. Next slide. So in order to head this off, we really need states to step into the breach. Um, states are uniquely situated to make this happen. First and foremost, because states are solely responsible for the regulation of the insurance industry. There's no federal role in regulating the insurance industry. It's all done state by state. And I think a lot of states are taking the approach of let's wait and see what happens here, and hopefully the insurance industry will just bail us out and save us from ourselves. And unfortunately, that is not going to happen. States are not going to see the insurance industry come to their rescue and solve this crisis for them. And they don't have very many incentives to do that. As I mentioned earlier, the insurance industries remained quite profitable through all of this turmoil. In 2024, the United States experienced roughly $110 billion in natural hazard losses. And that same year, the property and casualty insurance industry had $26 billion in profits just from their insurance underwriting. And their profits from their investment portfolios dwarfed that. And they raked in $164 billion on those investments, which is where the insurance industry makes most of its money, believe it or not. So, given that profitability, what motivation does the insurance industry have to change the way it's doing business? But states need to start making sure that that's exactly what they do. And they have the power and the authority and the responsibility to do so. Next slide, please. So, some of the things that states need to do in order to both recognize and address a growing insurability crisis are laid out here. So, the first and foremost is to identify and quantify the risks that are driving insurance prices up. They need to require insurers to actually share relevant data about those risks. Insurers have huge amounts of data that states are completely unaware of and not looking at. Information on future climate risks, information on catastrophe modeling, scenario analysis, lots of things that states can and should be asking for and reviewing and incorporating into their own plans, but are failing to do so. Um, Two of the other big ones are ensuring that building codes actually include requirements that reduce risks from the hazards that are most common in a state and driving up the cost of insurance to begin with. Hand in hand with those building codes, we also need states to adopt more risk-informed land use standards about where we're putting homes. And they also need to incentivize going beyond code uh, for both building and land use practices in areas that are potentially high risk today or will be high risk in the future. Beyond those two things, I think the two biggest series of actions are just to, one, invest in climate resilience and risk reduction efforts, just generally speaking. This is something that needs to be embedded in every decision that the state makes that has an impact on the built environment. And finally, there's a suite of actions that states need to take, and some states are taking, with regard to the administration of these FAIR plans and insurers of last resort, which I'd be happy to go into more detail about if anybody has any questions. So with that said, that concludes my presentation. There was a slide earlier that showed the report that I authored for NRDC and was released back in February. I'd urge you to go and look at that, called An Uninsurable Country, that lays out more detail on all of these things.
And we'll
Thanks
drop
a
that
bunch.
link in the chat. So thank you, Rob. Super interesting. I have a million questions, but I think something that might be helpful just to ground everyone is to explain a little bit more about how FAIR policies work, the state-backed option.
How they work. Yeah. So a FAIR plan is originally FAIR plans were set up in the early 1970s. There was a federal law called the Fair Access to Insurance Requirements. So FAIR is an acronym of that name. These were originally set up to provide insurance to redlined areas. If you remember in the 60s and 70s, there were a series of civil unrest, particularly in black neighborhoods, and riots. And insurers started like saying, no way are we going to insure these properties. And they started just stopping stopping coverage. So this law was put in place to ensure that those types of high risk properties would have somewhere to go in order to get coverage. Now, growth in FAIR plans isn't being driven by civil unrest, it's being driven by natural disasters. So what happens is a fair plan basically provides bare bones insurance coverage at a much higher cost than a private insurer would typically do. Many states' fair plans have non-compete clauses that are embedded in their statute, so they're not actually allowed to charge competitive rates against private industry, even though they're competing for properties that the private industry has already said we don't want to cover. That's again, that's not a universal rule, but it's a common feature that we see in fair plans. And the losses that fair plans do pay out uh, often aren't co the fair plans often don't have the financial resources to cover them. So you could
Right.
see a big disaster like the Los Angeles wildfires last year, where the damage that the fair plans were required to pay out far exceeded the cash they had on hand to do that. So what happens? So in that case, insurers, at least in California, insurers are responsible for one half of the first $1 billion of damage that the fair plan can't pay. So they paid $500 million for the LA fires beyond what they had to cover out of their own pocket. The rest,
I think we just lost Rob. Hopefully he'll come right back. Just give him a second. Sorry about that. In the meantime, I'm happy to take any questions if you have about the New Jersey tool. If you want to put it in the Q&A, I can also bring it up and show you how it works. So this is our New Jersey site. So you can search your community's flood risk by pressing here. You can join the movement, and that gets you on our New Jersey list for New Jersey events and releases. The New Jersey events pages you can find here. You have all of our research and policy here and our interactive tools. You can jump back down, and there's a couple of things that you can see. This is our atlas of accountability for New Jersey. There you are, Rob. You're on your phone. I'm going to stop sharing and you can continue to answer your question. Thank you for rejoining.
I am so sorry. My laptop decided that it wasn't plugged in and turned off. Um, Anyway, as I was saying, fair plans may or may not be able to cover the losses. So if you're an insurance policy holder in a state and a major disaster happens, you may find in next year's insurance bill a mysterious increase in your own premium. And that is because you are paying your share of the damages from that disaster. So, people in Northern California this year are seeing their bills increase in order to cover the losses of the LA fires last year. In Florida, this has become so common that it's now just called the hurricane tax.
Mm.
Every year people just automatically see an additional charge to cover the costs and the losses associated with the hurricane from the previous year. So it's something that we really caution states against allowing is passing these costs through to policyholders because it removes any financial incentive for insurers to invest in risk reduction or the state to invest in risk reduction. It just passes the cost of these disasters straight to the consumer and the homeowner.
So basically, what we're saying is insurance is going up and we're going to pay more. If you get dropped off, there's a potential for a state fair plan. However, if there's a big enough disaster, you're going to be on the hook anyway as a taxpayer. And
Exactly right.
then, right, third of which is if you're completely uninsurable, then you're on the hook. So, how is it that state budgets or the consumer, or is it possible that the losses don't end up in our pocketbooks?
Yeah, it is possible. States can make sure that insurers are not allowed to pass those costs to you. But that doesn't fix the problem of the losses. From my perspective, the one and only way to solve this problem long term is that states have to get serious, very soon about climate resilience and risk reduction efforts. We have spent decades, if not centuries, building a built environment that is not prepared for the future. We have building codes that, at best, will protect us from the disasters that happened last year or 5 years ago, but probably are not designed to hold up to the disasters that are going to happen 20, 30, or 40 years from now when we're still going to be relying on those buildings. Um, so unless we either start building disposable houses that are designed to only last 5 or 10 years and we just rebuild them all the time, or we start to
That's horrible.
put new building stock in place that's insurable for the long term and will hold up for the long term while we are also retrofitting the most vulnerable homes that we already have in the inventory. Those are the things that are really key.
I know you say that tongue in cheek. You don't really think that building and rebuilding homes are an option,
No,
especially
yeah,
because like the
nobody
mental
should say
anguish,
that was
right?
my recommendation. That is an awful recommendation. Thank you, Amy.
Somebody could have quoted you. I wanted to be clear that
Yeah,
that is not the option that we want because
thanks.
what we want to
Thanks for
do
looking out for me.
is stop this happening before it happens and before communities are suffering and before you're suffering either your lives or your livelihoods. And we have seen over and over again loss of life according to this. I'm curious, I'm always fascinated by the role of insurance commissioners in states. So states either have an elected insurance commissioner or an appointed insurance commissioner. And why are they not held more responsible for coming together and solving this crisis?
Yeah, well, not all, but most state insurance commissioners come to that job with a great deal of experience in the insurance industry. I mean, that's where they probably learned about what they need to do as insurance commissioners. So they tend to be very um, sympathetic to the industry's needs and the industry's desires. And like I said before, the industry is not suffering in this crisis, right? It's the insured that are suffering, not the insurers. So I think that contributes to part of the challenge that we're seeing. Also, and I'm seeing this in Illinois, where I work and reside right now. Illinois is experiencing huge double-digit increases in insurance prices year after year. And the state's reaction to that has been to finally put in place state approvals, requirements for the state to approve increases in insurance premiums. So price controls. But this isn't a pricing problem. They're only reacting to the fact that prices are going up in response to disaster losses. They are not looking at how do we reduce disaster losses. Like that has not even occurred to the state or the state insurance commissioner that that is what we need to be doing. And very few states are taking that approach. I think two that are doing the most in that regard, although still relatively small scale, are North Carolina and Alabama.
Do you want to explain what they're doing?
Yeah, in North Carolina and Alabama, they've been taking this step for several years now to basically they started by issuing grants to homeowners to put better roofs on their house, what we call fortified roofs that can hold up to very high wind speeds, hurricane force winds, and greatly reduce the potential for damage and for insurers to have to pay out losses on damaged roofs. So they started out by providing grants to homeowners to do that, and they've expanded that effort quite a bit. Now in Alabama, they've actually incorporated fortified roofs into the building code. So now you see lots of new homes in coastal areas. They have to get a fortified roof. In North Carolina, they're even doing through their FAIR plan what's called an insurance endorsement to get a new roof. So an endorsement basically means if your home's roof gets blown off in a hurricane, instead of the insurer simply slapping up the cheapest roof it'll pay for. It gives you an
Mm,
additional $10,000 through what's called an endorsement to put a fortified roof on. Because in North Carolina's FAIR Plan realizes um, they have a situation where insurers in North Carolina basically said years ago, we are not covering wind anymore in the coastline because of the hurricane risk. So we're just not going to cover wind. So the state FAIR Plan essentially became the only insurer for wind. And since they're carrying all of that risk, they realize, you know what, it's cheaper for us to make sure when we replace a roof to put one on that's going to last so we don't have to
mhm.
replace it again. But that's not a common practice.
So right now, if there's a horrible storm that's hitting New Jersey or anywhere else, in order for the kind of the money to start flowing, the government of or the governor of that state asks the president of the United States and says, "Hey, will you give us a disaster declaration?" If the president chooses yes, then money comes through FEMA, potentially from HUD, but other sources. If they say no, then the state is basically on the hook. So curious, your thoughts on like what is the state's incentives to act ahead of time if they know that there's a potential that the federal government steps in?
Well, I think it's important to remember that federal disaster aid does not make anybody whole. Um, so it's not a yeah, it's great to have if you need it, but it's not something that's going to change to fix out all the problems, right? These are still going to be tremendously costly to the state. If you don't get a declaration, then it's going to be even more costly to the state. And in these times, under this administration, that has become an even more uncertain proposition than it's ever been before. You know, lots of states are being denied disaster declarations that would have been routine
Mhm.
even 15 months ago. So that's become a bit of a dicey proposition. But disaster aid is not going to necessarily fix people's homes. In fact, it rarely provides much in the way of funding for home repairs. So insurance is really the primary means that people need to rely upon. But the consequences of what's happening go beyond just do I have insurance or not insurance, right? Like if you don't have insurance, your ability to recover from a disaster is severely inhibited. You're going to be facing some major challenges if you don't have insurance. If you Beyond just a disaster happening, though, states need to be thinking about this because if you don't have insurance, if you can't get insurance, that means you also can't sell your house because nobody else is going to get insurance on that house either. Also means you probably can't buy that house. Um, that means property values probably start to go down. And when property
Unless you can
values
pay
go down,
cash, right? So
unless you can pay
that's
cash, which most
unless you can
people
pay
can't.
cash.
So that means wealthy people can
Mhm.
have.
Wealthy
Um,
people will be able to live wherever they want, and not wealthy people maybe not. So,
Correct.
a lot of states have been doing the flood disclosure as part, passing legislation and flood disclosure. The way it is in New York right now, there's a huge loophole. You actually don't have to disclose at any specific point. It just has to be before the time of sale. And what happens is you don't disclose it. If you're a seller, an eager seller, you don't disclose it until you have to, which usually ends up being at time of closing. So you have already put down your 10 or 20%. You have gotten the inspection. You have done all these things that have cost you so much money. And now you're at closing and you may find out that it flooded, along with many, many, many other pieces of paper that you have to sign at acknowledgement. I'm wondering, well, I want to say what the hell, but first, like, have you seen other states do it differently and better? And what are the risks for disclosure versus non-disclosure? If if we're gonna, does that really mean like disinvestment in some places that we know are gonna flood?
Yeah, I think timing of disclosure is a really big concern. When I was at NRDC, my colleague Joel Scotta and I did a lot of work on disclosure. We were involved with passing the new disclosure requirements both in New Jersey and New York and many other states. But disclosure is most useful when that information is disclosed early on. In fact, the best time to disclose a home's history of disaster losses, whether it's from flood or some other hazard, is at the time a person makes an offer, at the time a contract is entered into. They should be given that information, in my opinion. Um, but every state has different requirements about when that information is disclosed. In some, it's on a mandatory form that's provided to anybody making an offer. On some, you may not get that information until closing. And that's pretty late in the process. And you're already kind of vested in purchasing this house, or you wouldn't be at the closing in the first place. But yeah, that's something that definitely we would love, I would love to see change is this disclosure being made to somebody at the time they make an offer. That is when all the chips should be put on the table. The buyer and the seller at that juncture should be working off the same information. And it's not fair that a buyer could get to just hold stuff back and not have to tell the seller. I mean,
Or not be obligated to tell the seller,
exactly. No,
right?
that's
There's so many
exactly
things
right.
like if there's mold, you have to disclose it. If there's all these different disclosures that
Yeah.
you have to do. That's just part of being, a fair transaction, a fair financial investment.
Yeah, and on flood disclosure, one of the things that we've pushed for, I should say we, not we, I don't work at NRDC anymore, but what NRDC has worked on is making sure that information is provided both on legal requirements to purchase flood insurance and the price of that insurance. Not all states have adopted that, but that should also be done not only for flood, but it should be done for other hazards as well, whether it's fire or hail or wind. Those are the things that are really driving damages. And people should know, like, hey, this house has experienced these challenges in the past, and we've had to make repairs. And here's what we paid for insurance, and
Yeah, or
here's what you
here's the
should know.
investment up front. You might
Yeah,
need to put in some money up front to make sure that you're safer than we were when we got
yeah.
flooded.
Now, some mostly home builders and realtors will tell you like, well, if you disclose that stuff, you're really going to cause people's property values to slide. It's like, well, are we? Because it's not like that information is going to be hidden from the homeowner forever. It's only hidden until they actually own the home, at which point they're incurring those costs anyway. So
Well,
I think it's a dangerous game of musical chairs that we're playing by trying to hide this information from home buyers and renters. Everybody knows the problem eventually, and now they have an incentive to hide that for as long as possible, and maybe they can sell it to the next unsuspecting person too.
and they will, and it'll continue to get passed
Yeah,
down and passed down. And we looked at New York City's 1 to 3 family homes that had flooded. I'm sorry, 1 to 3 family homes that were in the flood zone. We looked at it, I think it was 2023, and we saw which are the ones that changed hands in New York City. And we found that there were 7,000 sales of 1 to 3 family homes in that 1 year in New York City that were in flood zones. And that added up to $3.6 billion. So this is happening left and right, and people are going to flood before their mortgages due, and they're just passing on that risk. Taking this to a completely different subject, we have, I think it'll be one last question to see what you're seeing, kind of nationally. How are the voices of lived experiences and disaster survivors being incorporated into planning and policy decisions? Do you have
I
any
would
good
say
examples out
poorly.
there? Hmm?
Say very,
Do you say
in a
poorly?
in a general sense, quite poorly.
Yeah.
I think a long frustration I've had working in this field is that decisions tend to be made based on the desires of the people who make money buying and selling homes and building homes in unsafe places, right? Those tend to be the voices that get the most attention. Um, and the voices of people who have actually had to live with the consequences are often overlooked or not heard at all. And I think that's why it's so important that groups like Rebuild by Design and other organizations around the country are starting to bring these stories forward. And we're getting to the point, unfortunately, where it's hard to ignore what's happening. But state lawmakers are still terrified to make the right decision because making the right decision it's difficult, right? We have a lot of difficult choices ahead of us, frankly. Um, and the longer we delay in making them, the worse those choices become, and the fewer options we have available.
I want to give a shout out to like the New Jersey Organizing Project and other groups that are on the ground nationally organizing resilience. There's the Flood Survivor Network. There are a lot of people who are lifting up those voices, and everyone obviously needs to do it a lot better. So thank you, Rob, for spending your lunch hour with us. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We will post this video and the slides and Rob's report on our website by tomorrow. And we hope to see you at the next event.
Well, thanks for having me, and my apologies for my technical issues, but I'm glad I was able to rejoin and participate. So thanks everybody for attending today.